for all of the pre-session stuff that you guys had to review going into this week. But I'm back. This is another one of my favorite sessions. This is all about greenscaping. And I am really excited tonight because we have a couple of really, really great presenters joining us. But before I introduce them, you guys might have heard us say the word consortium a few times. Some folks that have had some experiences with WSA might have also heard about this, but we have a consortium of support professionals that really makes WSA special because it's a group of folks that have devoted or donated their time and energy to really kind of be our phone a friends. It makes my job a little bit easier, working through getting people connected as they need to be connected, whether that's for some help with it with developing restoration projects, whether that is design considerations, working with community engagement, grant writing, some of those really big things that our stewards really dive into. So that being said, we have two consortium members with us tonight. The first is Grace Schneider. Grace is working with me right now on a Clean Water Community project. I'm really excited about that. That's been a little bit hard to get off the ground, but it's finally coming together. I think we're going to be installing that this spring. But Grace is a landscape designer and class 3 watershed steward. So she has been around with WSA for quite a long time. She is with McHale Landscape Design, and one of her friends at that firm, Matt Roderick, is with us as well. Matt is landscape architect and also a consortium member. So they are going to be talking to you tonight about some landscaping considerations. They're going to give you the perspective of what landscape professionals kind of look at when they're looking at a site. And that will be through the lens of maybe 3 case studies, I believe it was. I don't see anyone's faces, but I'm gonna, yep, there's Matt. I'm gonna shake my own head. But this is hopefully gonna help us work through the learning objectives that we see here. And it's going to be another breakout night. So half of you will be going with Matt and Grace. Half of you will be coming or staying with me. But we kind of have the breakout mojo going. If you can, make sure to mute yourself. We're going to be asking you to keep your questions into the chat. But then as you're working through, we're going to have you actually ask your own questions tonight so you can have some interaction with these folks. And just for your reference, we're going to be recording both sessions so you can reference them a little bit later. So I think with that, I'm going to stop sharing this screen. I'm thinking Francesca has our breakouts ready. So if anybody doesn't have any questions, I think we're going to dive right in.
Great. So half of you should have it. Perfect. Everyone's getting the flow. Excellent. All right. So this is our group. So Suzanne or Grace and Matt, if you want to go ahead and get started.
I'll go ahead and pull up a shared screen here. So
perfect.
Grace will kind of start off, but just wanted to let you all know that we're going to be talking about problem areas in landscape design and 3 specific case studies. So with that, I'll let Grace start for us.
Okay, so Matt and I work at McHale Landscape Design. We have over 40 years of combined industry experience with environmental design and stormwater management. McHale is really a design build firm. And today we're going to show you projects that we've worked on that have the following design challenges. That is wet areas, steep areas, and shady sites. You go ahead, Matt. Change it. Yeah, you can change it again.
So I'm going to focus on wet areas first. And, the interesting thing about a site that is inundated with water, especially after a rain event, is you would think you would want just plants that can handle a ton of water, wet feet, water on the roots all the time. But you actually want something that's pretty well-rounded, because you're going to have, with poor soils that you find in wet areas, you'll find times of dry spells. You'll find that if it's not raining, if there's not water heading to the site, they're going to be super dry. The soil that is usually typical of a wet area is the clay soil or poorly draining soil. So in the other way, when there isn't water, it's shutting off the roots. It's preventing it from being able to get nutrients, getting water. So you really end up wanting a plant palette that's a little more well-rounded. And then something we look at as far as just a good, better, best, or a high, medium, low, medium, high intensity of how we would attack a site. First is choose the right plants. Second would be, work the soil, remediate the soil. And then third, if we have opportunities upstream, let's solve the problem altogether. Let's stop the water from going to the site if we can, capture it off site or lower the amount of water going on to site. So what we're doing is our first case study is a project in Saunders Point. This was Carvel Lane, which is the main drag down Saunders Point. The central median was originally a planted median. As time went on, it became turf. Time went a little bit further, it became parking area for people, for overflow parking. That overflow parking then turned into gravel, extra space where people kept cars and boats. And what happened was what was normally a vegetated space all of a sudden became impervious area, became poor soil, became low root area, just grass. And so the water that was normally heading to that site and going in the ground was staying above ground. And so we had a site that was just completely inundated with water. And so we took sort of all three steps in the low, medium, high intensity in this project, but we chose the right well-rounded plants. We came in and we fixed the soil. We amended the soil with gravel in a base layer, sand, and then good planting soil above. So it allowed water to infiltrate down and in. And then we got a group of stewards, a group of volunteers together to help us plant the thing. And, the key here was not only native plants and the right fit plants for the site, but we had overhead power lines. And so one of the challenges was, how do we get that tree layer, that canopy layer without going too tall? And so what we chose was these sweet bay magnolias here, which were just phenomenal for the site and thriving out there today because they can handle the periodic inundation of water. They're great native, they got a great flower to them, but they don't grow too tall. They fit within the space. So again, our solution thing, and we'll keep kind of going back to it, but the, 3-step process of this was find the right plants, use the water loving, well-rounded plants, things that can handle periodic inundation, the soil replacement, making sure that clay soil that didn't drain was taken out of there. And if we don't have the opportunity to take the soil out of there, the next thing we say is this idea of a vertical drainage pit, the ability to dig down past the clay layer, get to a soil that actually does drain, and let all of the area drain to that space. So if we can't totally go through and replace all the soil, at least find a way to get through it and make sure that we have a good drainage ability. And then the upstream issues, once we took on this project, we had adjacent neighbors, jumping in, helping out, realizing that, hey, my roof area, my downspouts, my driveway all goes to this as well. What can I do on my own property to help? So we started having a lot of jump off projects that came from this as well. And I think that was one of the, the best outcomes we could have had.
Okay, so steep slopes. Basically, the biggest problem with steep slopes is erosion and loss of quality planting soil, and that usually occurs on a slope that has no vegetation on it. So vegetation is extremely important to have on a steep slope. Long-term stabilization, basically consider using more practices, or I should say, in addition to planting, more practices like rain tanks and biologs, which we're going to show you in our examples. And then irrigation of plants, especially to get established, since it is a steep slope, water runs off quickly. So it's kind of a dry area. And especially to get it established, you need to keep that in mind. So have a plan ready to hopefully have broadcast sprinklers that go over the top and cover the entire slope, or use drip irrigation, soaker hoses that can also cover it. And then maintenance and installation access needs to be considered. Since it's a steep slope, it makes it difficult to access and therefore more labor intensive and will cost typically more money. Okay, so in this area here, this is the back of a house on the Severn River, and basically their downspouts are coming out onto the lawn, and the stormwater is sheet flowing across the lawn, and it kind of it funneled right here underneath the steps, and then it went down the hill underneath the steps. And if you can see that platform, that deck below, there is a shed or boathouse kind of underneath that. And that was getting water penetration through it. So what we tried to do is we couldn't really do anything up the hill to mitigate the water. So what we did was we put in rain tanks, which are these, they almost look like milk cartons that snap, or I should say the crates that milk used to come in that snap together. And they act as almost a French drain void of the stone. So there's nothing in it. It's all 95% void. So therefore it can store a lot of water, and it's not really storing it because it's totally open sides. So, but it's temporarily storing it. So what you see here on the plan, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but basically we did we did 2 lines of defense to get to this deck and the storage area beneath it. And those are lines of rain tanks that we put underground, and they almost acted as a catch basin because we didn't bury them all together underground. We wrapped them in filter cloth to help keep the sediment out. And on the low side, we used pond liner so that it wouldn't blow out the hillside. And on the top of them, we used river jack. And so the river jack allowed the water to go in. It would catch the water, and it would then, if it got too full, it would kind of permeate out of the top. And so you can see here, the river jack, those rain tanks are underneath there. And then the boulders are adding more support to hold the rain tanks in place. And at the bottom there, you can see a picture of the little shed / boathouse and the hillside that was stabilized with plantings. I mean, it actually had the planting even before this issue, but we just, reorganize and planting them. It's super important to have your hillside planted. Okay, so this is another case study on Lake Ogleton, where you can see how eroded and steep this hillside is. All the roots are exposed, and it's just bare ground, barely any vegetation. It's a very shady spot too, which makes it difficult. So basically here we used core fiber logs to help kind of create shelves so that it would be less likely that the new plants, well, the soil amendment we put in, the new plants we plant, and the mulch we use to help keep them moist and grounded wouldn't wash away. And so those are temporary. They last about maybe 5 years, but they disintegrate in place. And they definitely, create a mound even when they disintegrate. So they're kind of creating a shelf. You can also see all the plants that we use there. That's a ton of quartz and gallon grasses and pretty much all grasses, carex and sea oats and juncus. And then here you can see the core fiber logs from the water and the planted slopes. And that project, even in the shade, because of the types of plants that we use, really did do a very good job. We were very happy about it. And we planted a ton of plants knowing that there was all this root competition, lack of sunlight, and lack of water because of the root competition too. So the good, better, best. So, once again, you want to use a lot of plants on your steep hillsides because exposed earth means it's going to erode no matter what. And then the temporary stabilization through like the core fiber logs or soil matting, like that could be Curlex or coconut fiber matting to hold the plants and whatnot in place. And then, you'll end up with the result of the permanent stabilization through that retainage and the plantings.
So as Grace was sort of alluding to, it's interesting, but a lot of our sites that are shady and have a lot of overstory cover that are problem areas for us are also steep slope sites. And so, the same things we run into on a steep slope, we run into in a shady area. There's, lack of rooting area. There's lack of nutrients on, in the ground on the sloped area and underneath all of the overstory tree cover. And the biggest thing we have is just the lack of sun. We have to work with plants that may not be the, beautiful pollinator flowering plants, but these are going to be things that we're talking about native understory plantings that are going to be holding soil, removing, any of the issues of stuff that comes down with stormwater and soaking up and letting infiltrate a lot of that water. So this is a project, Carrollton Manor in Severna Park. We had a steward come to us and take a look at their beach access, community beach access at Hill Bottom Beach. There was a steep slope within the woods itself that was eroding away. And the issue was they just couldn't get plants to take hold. They couldn't get, the space to really stick around for them. And that was mainly because it was a lot of sand and a lot of overstory trees, a lot of shade. So getting things to grow in there was definitely a challenge. So Lisa Bender, who's in the middle here, was our steward that brought this to our attention. We were able to work together on this one and, really tackle a tough site. So the majority of what we did from a shade-loving garden space was within the steep sloped area shown here that was essentially eroding away, coming across their parking lot, and then eventually onto their beach area down below. And so what we did is we had to work with an engineer on this one because of the severity of the slopes, because of the proximity to the water. We pulled from our hat another, few consortium members and really tried to get together on this. But the idea was that, this layer of canopy trees and evergreens was covering up the hillside area. There was no understory layer. And so in a big rainstorm, this was all just washing away and coming apart. So came in with a full-scale grading plan, but something that, really matched the intensity needed for a site like this. And what we found was that if we could, we wanted to provide a little bit more natural stabilization through the use of sandstone boulders, which the sandstone is native to the Severn River there and in a lot of the Severn River watershed. And so we were using a stone that was coming out of the ground on the site or around the site anyway to do these stacked retaining walls. And then we were going to backfill them with good soil and plant them. And so we worked from an all native plant palette, and we've got, copies and a couple things at the end to go over with the plants, but we worked from an all native plant palette that we knew would handle the shade. We've set up this vertical stabilization and retainage with these sandstone boulders. We added in the core fiber logs, as Grace was talking about in the last project, and even some soil matting with the Curlex in order to set the stage for those native plants. And so the idea was, a set of tiered retainage and then plantings that went all along it. And so we had inkberry, winterberry, viburnum, bayberry, and a bunch of grasses, things that, all could handle the deep shade that were in there. And the result was a really great feature up against their community access, community parking area. And then what just ended up looking like and turning into a real, forested buffer, which was really the result. And the end goal was that, we now had coverage in that understory layer. So when we're talking about, good, better, best, again, our low, medium, high intensity, we think the use of the shade tolerant perennials, ground covers, even shrubs, creating that understory level is a great, step as we go through this. Ideally, especially in shady sites, let's work with the shade. Let's continue to keep that forested area forest for years to come. Why not naturalize it with a little bit of an understory meadow mix? Let it be, totally no maintenance or low maintenance. or even, best option is even to turn it into really a forest conservation area with succession planting. Make sure that next level of understory and trees and things that'll go on for years to come is really in there, because if something's a forested shady buffer now, we want to keep it as much as possible for years to come.
Okay, so we put together these plant palettes from plants that we use all the time in these situations. And they'll be here for your future use. And this one is, pretty clear enough. Go down to the steep slopes one, Matt.
Yeah. How are we on time, by the way, guys? Or do you want us to delve into this a little bit, or we can kind of do the Q&A?
You have 9 minutes left, so you could probably cover a little bit more. I know you're doing amazing.
Perfect.
Oh, okay. Well, one thing I wanted to say about steep slopes is that I have here trees. Do not plant trees on steep slopes, because if they topple, then they're going to take out their whole root mass, and it can turn into an erosion nightmare, because you'll have a huge hole in your slope. So do not consider planting trees on a steep slope. And then shrubs, you have to be careful that they don't have kind of a large canopy, because maybe their root mass isn't quite as extensive as, say, grasses and perennials, and then they shade the area underneath them. And so therefore with the lack of root mass and then the shade, it creates exposed earth and you get erosion. And so that's why, grasses and perennials do a great job on steep slopes. And you will see a lot of these plants kind of in both lists, or in all 3 lists, just because when it gets into a tough situation, especially steep slopes like Chasmanthium or sea oats, and sea oats are almost invasive, but that's what you want on an area that is hard to control, is a good guy who's just going to take over and run over the site, and that would be sea oats. And then switchgrass, panicum, that has an extremely extensive root system. And so that is another really, really good one for stabilizing areas. The other plants are good, maybe make it more pretty, and they are just on there, they're kind of tough, like they don't need a lot of tender loving care, as in water and a lot of nutrients. So, and then you want to go to shady area there?
Yeah, and I think, one thing I'd say we found, so with steep slopes, we also like sticking to a shrubs, perennials, grasses palette, because at the end of the day, we have to install them and maintain them safely. And a lot of these areas we're talking about are slopes that you have to be kind of a billy goat to walk up and down and access. And so the smaller the pots, the smaller the plants, and the more of them, you get a better root matting, but you also have an easier installation process and easier maintenance process throughout it as well. And as Grace said, a lot of these plants really jump between all of the palettes, just because these are our sort of proven winners that we know are tough plants that make it through. We're talking about 3 different tough situations here.
Yeah, and another point to make about these plantings is we like to plant en masse. And, of course, if you have a small area, you can't get too big of masses, but at least 7 to 10 in a grouping. If it's a large area, if you can do 100 in a grouping, it works better than individual plants. And part of the reason for that is when it comes to maintenance, it's easier if the plants are in a mass. It is easier to determine if there are weeds growing in them. And so if you can just spot it, like when invasives come up, like say on a steep slope, then you can spot these new plants that are coming in and they don't look like the other ones. And, even more of a novice can do that. And sometimes, if you have maintenance people, it's just easier even for them to be able to read a mass versus having more of an English garden approach where it's one here, one there, one here, one there. So that's another point that we like to make with these areas and in all landscaping, really. We kind of live by that rule, plant in mass.
Great. Thank you guys so much. So we have just 4 minutes left. Is it all right if we go to questions?
Sure.
Perfect.
Okay. If anybody has one, feel free.
This is Mary. I actually have two quick questions. We often encounter slopes which also have trees. And how do you do dense planting of, native grasses, perennials when you have the issue of staying out of the drip line of the tree? That's one question. And then number two, with the quarter logs, do you recommend the ones where you actually plant in the logs as well as around them, front and back?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Mary. So, with the drip line of the tree, what we try to do, and I might go back here to some of these pictures. So like this project in Carrollton Manor, we ended up densely planting, the areas that weren't immediately under the drip lines, but even within the drip line of the tree, if I can draw kind of on the side here, if we had, let's say this is the trunk and the canopy of the tree, we might find a space where it's like 1, 2, 3 from the standpoint of some shrubs within there. But it's going to be hand work. It's going to be hand digging because you're going to find, okay, there's a main line of a nice big root here. There's another root here. As something winds through, we're not going to cut anything, but we are going to work in the pockets around them because we still want some coverage underneath. We might also find that an area like this might be better suited to do a little bit of overseeding, and then put down a core fiber mat, something where we've got a little bit of stabilization, and then we overseed right in it or on top of it, and that falls right into your mention of the fiber logs as well. The planting logs where you can do live stakes where you do the plantings within them are great because as that breaks down over the years and you've got that layer of mulch on top, those roots are going right into the hillside and they've got something to cling on to in the meantime. So that's a perfect way to think about it.
Thank you.
Great. In a couple more minutes, if anybody else has a question, feel free to speak up.
I don't want to dominate, but because this is potentially part of my capstone, these areas we have with slopes and shade and trees, is out of the choice of shrubs, perennials, and grasses. I was curious, the grasses with the deep roots, do they ever work under and around trees?
Those are panicum that are usually fairly sun-loving.
Okay, right.
Probably not, but sea oats, no
Okay.
problem.
Yeah, and sea oats are an interesting one because they are a native, but they are definitely a kind of what we call a worst case scenario or last option kind of native. I mean, they are phenomenal, but they will become the dominant understory planting of a site. And so if you don't have anything else that can grow there, it's a great plant because it's going to hold the soil. It's going to take up, any of the extra water going down there, and it's going to stop anything from running off. So they do really well, but they almost do too well sometimes. So
Yeah.
always a good choice if you don't have anything else.
All right. Thank you guys so much. That was wonderful. I'm going to send you over to the other group and Josh is going to come to ours. But thank you, Grace and Matt. That was so great. All right, so Josh will be joining us in just a second, and he's going to go through the conservation landscape tool, as he mentioned. I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready to plant after hearing that. That was so cool. There's so much great information.
Hey, Francesca, I had to join a little bit late. I assume it looks like you are recording. I can jump in and catch up a little bit later.
Yep, no problem. We'll post it when it's all set.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Francesca, I'm trying to figure out how to move myself over to Grace and
yeah.
Matt's group, and I cannot figure that out.
I can do that for you.
Thank you.
Did it pop up?
Hey, everybody, can you hear me?
Yes. Thanks,
Yeah.
Josh.
Okay, that took a minute to get back here. Let me go ahead and jump right in then. I'm going to share my screen. I hope everybody enjoyed Matt and Grace. So tonight we're going to talk about conservation landscaping, and we're going to introduce our next assignment. So if everybody can see my screen, yep, I'm sharing. I think the easiest place to start with this is what is conservation landscaping? And what we're going to kind of talk about tonight is what I like to call the big C or the little C conservation landscaping. And, you know, kind of diving into what that looks like. What I mean by that is conservation landscaping can be a practice and a state of mind. So we have kind of textbook definitions of conservation landscaping. You can see one on your screen here for what the Alliance actually describes it. It goes over kind of the hows and whys of what it is and how it gets worked into the landscape. But typically, you can see conservation landscapes being referred to as a noun, which tends to be the practice or the big C, or a verb, which is the state of mind or the little c. And we're going to just kind of go over both here in the next little bit. So the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council has 8 tenets of what makes a conservation landscape. I'm not going to go through this, but again, it kind of really highlights the hows and whys of how this kind of came to be. So as we're thinking through conservation landscaping, especially the lowercase c, the state of mind, it's pretty great because you can incorporate it into pretty much any landscaping practice that you're trying to do, without specifically really aiming to treat water or stormwater, even though that's going to be kind of an additional add-on benefit of the whole thing. Again, you're working with nature on your site. You're trying to reduce your lawn area, and you're really trying to work with as many native plants as possible. And as you guys have probably heard ad nauseum from me in the last week, you know, there's so many great benefits that happen with native plants, whether that's a reduction in water, because of their acclimation to our climate. There's less fertilizers that are needed. They have built-in defenses against the critters that run around, so there's probably less pesticides needed. And that all really translates to a reduced maintenance cost over time. Again, we are champions of our native plants, especially in the Chesapeake. I'm hoping I was able to review everybody's answers from last week's assessment. I think everybody's pretty comfortable in defining what a native plant is, so that's really good to see. So again, the lowercase c, the state of mind conservation landscaping is just, you know, something to keep in mind as you're working in your local landscapes. So when we talk about conservation landscape or the capital C or the actual practice, there's some things to keep in mind. There's actual design considerations that go into this. So on this next slide, we're actually seeing what a conservation landscape looks like in what is called sectional view. Or another way to think about this is if you have a birthday cake and you cut a slice out, so you're looking at it kind of vertically. And as I said in my videos going into this week, when you're thinking about a best management practice, you're thinking about how water enters the practice, what happens when it's there, and how it gets out. And in this situation, stormwater will enter into a conservation landscape through overland flow. It might have a direct input from a downspout. There are a few other means, but the overland flow and the downspout are typically what you're probably going to see. And as it enters, there's usually a pre-treatment. And when I say pre-treatment, it's a way to dissipate energy. And that's really important because as water is flowing into a practice, if it's not slowed down properly, it can start to cut in and erode. It can wash away plants. It can start causing damage. So the pre-treatment is a really key important part of how water gets into a practice. And in this drawing, it looks like we're using sedge or another type of grass here. So as the water is entering into this, I'm hoping you guys can all see my cursor here, but the planting area has some plants in it. It has a little bit of a depression here. So when you think about some of our other practices like rain gardens or bioretention, we could have a ponding depth of 12 inches. It could be a pretty robust bathtub. This is a shallower bathtub. This is probably only going to be top 6 inches deep. And that kind of goes for what's going on below the surface as well. Some of our other retention practices could be, feet deep. We're really only looking at a soil depth of about 6 to 12 inches here. And in this practice, you probably aren't looking at too much soil remediation, depending on what you're looking at with your native soils. But the idea is you're digging down to get it fluffy. You're trying to get some air into that soil, which gives some space in between the soil molecules for some space for the water to go down. So that being said, you're thinking about the water going into the practice. You're thinking about the water kind of sitting in this shallow bathtub, kind of sitting, soaking into the fluffed up soil. And that's probably how the water is going to be getting out most of the time. Now, like all practices that hold water, if you have a major storm event, you're really going to want to make sure that there's a way for the water to get out if it needs to in an emergency or in an overflow situation. And in this drawing, the overflow looks like it might be cobble or some stones. And again, that's all about dissipating energy and making sure that we're not seeing any sort of erosion as water's coming out. Does that make sense to everybody? So like other BMPs, we're really trying to think through where not to maybe use these or install these. This is very brief here, but like other water retaining practices, we want to keep it at least 10 feet off the building foundation. We want to be mindful of both private and public utilities. And that's really important. And that leads to your daily reminder of calling Miss Utility before you put a shovel into the ground. It's very expensive if you hit a utility. So I highly suggest that if you are excavating at all, if you are breaking dirt, you need to call or visit missutility.net. It's a free service, and it is incredibly important to do that. So like other practices, especially what we talked about this week, there's a lot of design considerations. I'm going to kind of gloss over this so we can get into the assignment part of this. But you're keeping in mind the sunniness of your site. You're thinking about the soil and drainage considerations. So similarly to like rain gardens or other retentions, you're not going to want to put a conservation landscape in an area that is low infiltration. So when you're thinking about soils, your C or D soils, because you don't want this to become a mosquito breeding ground. You don't want your plants to die, from too much water. So those are definitely some major considerations to think about as you're siting these in the landscape. And the last one that I really want to highlight, because this is incredibly important, is the idea of maintenance and long-term maintenance. I think that was our last video to look at this week, but it really is one of the great things for kind of outcompeting our invasives. And what that really comes down to is having a really robust planting plan. It comes down to density, making sure that you have enough plants that are happy and healthy and thriving, that there's no chance that invasives can kind of creep in and get a foothold. So with that, we kind of covered the big C and the little c. So we are going to visit the handy dandy WSA website, which is aawsa.org. You'll have a link to this actual conservation design tool or conservation landscape design tool in your assignment. So, and I think we actually have that on the website as well. This was something that you should have investigated a little bit as you were getting into this session this week, but I just want to point out that there is a little bit of information here about what the tool does and doesn't do. This is a great tool that gives you kind of an overview. It gives you a good place to start. It's not something that will be completely tailored to your site, but it really does give you a good foundation with your projects. So you're going to just kind of step through this whole thing. It gives you an idea of what some of this might cost when it comes down to installation. But then this is what's really interesting about this for me. It gives you 5 different options of different types of conservation landscapes that you can kind of get out of this whole thing, right? So we have a simple meadow. We have a tree as a focal point. We have your typical kidney, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You can look for a screening conservation landscape, or you can look at a pollinator garden. So the tool itself is going to ask you some questions or have you think about some of the site conditions. So like we've talked about the sunniness and how wet the soil might be. And then you really, as you're using this conservation landscape, you should have an idea of the square footage of the project that you want to be designing, if that makes sense. So that's what you kind of want to collect before you start using the tool. Apparently the website's not. Okay, so as you get to kind of the last bit of this, you have all of these 5 different opportunities to kind of design a site. So I'm going to click on the typical kidney here, and we're going to do 180 square feet. So again, you want to have an idea what that square footage looks like. This is scalable, so if you have a project that is bigger than this, say you have one that is 400 square feet, you would use 2 of the 180 square feet guys to have an idea of what to plant in the 400 square foot. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so I'm going to click on the 180 here. So once you kind of decide what size you're looking at and what kind, it gives you some options for the sun. It gives you some options for the soil. Let's go ahead and have a sunny kidney that is probably pretty dry soil. So we're going to click on that guy. And so this is thinking, it doesn't take as long as the GIS, so that's helpful. But when I say kidney shaped, if everybody can see my cursor, it does spit out just your typical kidney shaped planting bed here. Does everybody see that?
Mm-hmm.
So from here, you'll see that you have some call outs or some labels here. You'll have a tree, you'll have some shrubs. It'll give you the numbers of the trees and shrubs. And then it'll also give you perennials or grasses or sedges as well.
Josh,
So-
can I ask a question?
Oh, they want questions.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want questions to wait till the end?
You can, but go ahead.
I was just wondering is there a particular logic behind the kidney shape?
So it all goes into the design considerations that we talked about in the video, right? So if you think about what this would look like, so this is what we call plan view, but if you looked at this in section view, you know, you're thinking about stepping down in size, you're thinking about depth. That's really what this helps spit out. So but that's something that's a great question, because as you're looking through the next steps here, you're really going to want to be thinking about the height and the width of some of these. So let me get to the next parts here. So the second page starts to talk about what options you might have with the plants. So if everybody can see here, it says grass, sedge, or rush. Does everybody see that highlighted spot there? If you go back to the actual plan, there's a section here that says grass, sedge, or rush here at the bottom. So as you're working through this, this would be a great option for that part of the design. Does that make sense to everybody? This will be important as I'm walking through the assignment too. So as you're looking at this plan, try to think about it like you're reading a book. So we're going left to right, up to down in this, and that'll make sense in a minute. So it gives you some options for all of the grasses or the sedges or the rushes. It starts to get into the perennials. And then on the third page, we actually start talking about shrub options and tree options. It gives you the plant type, which corresponds to the box on the plan. It gives you the Latin name or the scientific name. It gives you the common name. It gives you some planting conditions to consider. It gives you what type of maintenance you might be looking at, and then it gives you the spacing. So that spacing really, typically with plants, maybe not so much trees, but with perennials and shrubs, pretty much should give you an idea of height and width. And then here, I just want to signpost this part of this because we'll talk about this with your actual assignment. It gives you some material considerations, whether that is dig outs or mulch cover or things like that. And then really nicely, it actually gives you the basis of a maintenance plan here. So this is kind of the very bare bones of what you would be looking at for a maintenance regimen for a conservation landscape. It's probably just the beginning. It's very much tailorable or made to be tailored to your site. So that's really helpful. Francesca, we're at what, 14 minutes left?
13.
13, okay. I think I'm right on time. That's great. So now we're going to jump into the actual assignment. I'm sure you guys are excited about this. We're looking at this being due on the 9th.
Sorry, Josh, I meant 7.
Oh, geez. Okay. That's not good. We're gonna just work through this, but keep in mind that I have an extended question session tonight specific to this assignment, and you guys can absolutely schedule some time if you need help with me with office hours. So really, the first part of your assignment is to go through the tool and get to this point. You guys can see that this is a downloadable PDF up here. Does everybody see that? So you're going to be given a practice site, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that has its own specific conditions. So you're going to kind of take those conditions and figure out or make the decision of what kind of practice you want to put in there. Okay. So you're going to produce your PDF, and then we have something known as a seasonal interest chart. And so when we look at a seasonal interest chart, it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. In this situation, so I have a column here that says CL design tool label. So again, if you go back to your plan, the CL design tool label is what's above the box. So if this were a normal year, we'd actually have you physically write in these boxes what plant you wanted to put there. But because this is all going to be submitted electronically, just do your best to kind of label this so that it's kind of apples to apples. So in this situation, it would be 3 Ilex verticillata or winterberry hollies that would be going in this section here. Does everybody see what I'm talking about? If you have questions about that, let's touch base. That might be a little confusing as you're working through this. But the idea of a seasonal interest chart is exactly what it sounds like. When you install something in the landscape, you absolutely want to have some interest year round. You want to have some aesthetic appeal. So as you're thinking through each of these plants, so for example, the winterberry holly, from about February to October is green. You know, it's an herbaceous plant. But then from November to January, it has these really beautiful red berries on it. So you're kind of mapping out what that looks like through the year. For your cardinal flower, you know, it might be blooming from July to October, but maybe from March to June here, and I'm going to just show you how to do this in Excel. You can go up to your paintbrush here and you can say, well, it has leaves at that point, but then maybe from November and December on, you know, it's brown, right? It's kind of asleep at that time of the year, right? So that's really how you're filling this out. But what you're really trying to do is to make sure that you don't have any gaps throughout the year. So just looking at this, I might look for something that would bloom in the spring to incorporate. So as you're making your decisions about what these perennials look like, you're really wanting to make sure that you have something that's pretty throughout the year. One thing that I want to signpost to you, this is a really important thing to keep in mind when using this tool. in regards to the shrubs and the trees, it gives you a really good spit out of how many of those to use based on the square footage. But with the perennials and with the grasses, I would suggest doubling the numbers that it gives you. Okay. We've come to find that the tool itself is a little bit low on the it's a little stingy with the number of perennials. And keep in mind that we're really looking for that high density to make sure that that you're working against those invasives. As you guys are on the rainscaping track and working through working on your designs, you're going to see in conversations with me that I actually prefer to keep it at about 7 to 9 inches on center for perennials. That's a really heavy density. But for you guys kind of working through what you're looking at here, you're probably going to want to just, kind of keep it at 1 foot on center.
All
So
right,
that
and
was-
Josh, just so you know, we have 4 minutes.
Okay, I'm working through here. So that we talked about the PDF, we talked about the seasonal interest chart. And so just before we jump off this page, you have some of the parameters of the site here. So keeping that in mind as you're working through your design. And then you have a walkthrough of how to use the tool here. And keep in mind, I'm available if you guys want to set up a time to talk, all of that fun stuff. The last thing that is part of your assignment is this PowerPoint. I'm hoping that after your community presentations, you have a pretty solid idea of how to use that. What I'm asking you to do is actually draw. So if you guys can see my cursor here, there is a circle button up here. You can hit that circle, and then wherever you want to put on this plan a circle or an oval, you can kind of move it around. So say you want to put your conservation landscape there. That's great. But then over here in this text box, I just need 3 to 4 sentences as to why, justify why you want to put it there. Does that make sense to everybody? So you guys will see if you go into your Google folder, you now have a folder entitled Conservation Landscape. That's where all of this stuff lives. You guys should be able to update that yourself. What I mean by that, they're your own templates. You can use them and change them however you see fit. But I think that kind of brings me to the end of this. I'm sorry that was a lot of information, but I'm going to stop sharing so I can better see some questions or see you guys if you have questions.
Go ahead and speak up if you do have a question. And don't forget that this is recorded, so you can revisit it and the slides as well.
And I have an extended time at the end as well. I'm really hoping that the actual assignment itself is pretty self-explanatory as you work through it, so it shouldn't be too difficult.
And Josh, I do think it's going to be one of those things that we need to start getting into the tool before we're going to have questions. It's really difficult at this point for us to start asking questions before, when we've just been exposed to the tool.
Totally agree. And so as you're working through that and questions come up, I'm hoping you guys know by now that if you have, user questions or more in-depth questions or whatever, just go ahead and shoot me an email. That's the easiest. I try to respond as quickly as possible.
Josh, I have a question. When you showed the plan with like the house and where the existing stuff is, are all we doing is having to drop in where we want to put our conservation planting? I mean, all that other stuff is there.
Yeah, all that other stuff is there. So that's all stuff
Okay,
to keep
just picking
in
our
mind,
spot.
though. You're just picking your spot, but you're reading that map to kind of think about where windows might be, where downspouts are, where trees are. All of that is something to keep in mind. Something that I
Okay.
will say also is that it's not to scale. So use your best judgment. A door is typically 36 inches wide, so that'll give you an idea of sizing and that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Josh, I have a quick question. Will we be able to use this like in support of our capstone project?
Absolutely. So this coupled with GIS is really great for your sites. So if you are in the county in particular, and even the city, I think you can use the measurement tool. You can get a rough idea of the square footage you're looking at, and then you can turn around and drop that into the design tool. Think about the square footage, think about the site conditions, and you can start to get an idea of what your plants might look like, or what the layout of your project might look like.
Okay.
All
And I-
right,
the-
and with that, we've got the others joining us. Thank you so much, Josh. That was really great. I'm really excited to kind of look deeper into that tool. So with that, am I handing it back to you, Josh?
I think
Suzanne.
Suzanne's jumping on here.
Perfect. So we'll give everybody a little bit of time to get back.
All right, so Josh, am I supposed to do this part?
Yep, if you don't
Okay,
mind.
sure. So this is the week of February 23rd, and in our learning pods, we're going to be seeing the rest of our community presentation. So that's what's up in your learning pod. And then we will not have any learning pods or classes next week, and our learning pods will actually get scrambled up and changed the week of March 8th. So we're working on people's availability, what their capstone projects are, what their track is, and we're trying to group people by not only their availability, but similarities in capstone projects. So stay tuned for that. And many of you will get a new staff person to get to know. So it's a nice opportunity to get to know a smaller group of your classmates. I don't know if you're like me, but I really love those small group interactions because I feel like on a class like this, I don't get to talk to almost very many of you. So I really like that small group. Josh is working on rainscaping site visits. So he's reviewing everybody's part 1 capstone who's in the rainscaping track. And the deal is that he's going to review those, do your site visit, and then right after your site visit, respond with feedback to your part 1 and to the site visit, so it's all together. So those are getting scheduled, and he's trying to triage those by geography and who's sort of most ready to get started. If you're wondering about when yours is coming, just let Josh know. Noelle is also working through the ELIT capstone part 1s, and she's going to be getting feedback to those as she works through them. But if you have any questions about yours, just feel free to let her know. And if you're one of those people that is set to get started very quickly, you might let her know that. But my sense is she probably already has that idea. Next week is a big week. It is WSA's 10th annual conference. So for 10 years, we've been doing this conference, and it's my favorite day of the year. I think I like it better than Christmas because I see all of these people that I love and get to hug them and catch up with them. And that is not going to be happening, but we are going to all be together in spirit. And we have worked a lot of great interaction into the conference. And kudos out to Francesca, who has herded a lot of cats and is really going to bring us some great programming. So that's next week. So no class, no pod, all conference. So I think next slide.
Just to let my pods know that we will be meeting on Monday, though.
Oh yeah, Josh, I forgot his group is last. And then session assessments. We had a whole bunch of people that didn't do their session assessments from last week. So if that's the case for you, if you please do them, it's really helpful. It helps us to know what we're doing, who we need to connect with, what the hiccups are. We are adjusting on the fly every single week. So we're making changes and updates based on people's feedback. And actually there was a lot of feedback that went into tonight's session based on what people did and did not understand about rainscaping. So please, please, please do those. Our next session is my very favorite session. It's on the 9th of March and it's Habits That Help. So we're going to be joined by Steve Robbie, who is my personal mentor and friend, and really the mad genius of helping people change their behavior. So we're going to be talking all about social science that night, and then also diving into different pollution sources and ways to reduce those pollution sources. So there will be a bunch of pre-session coursework that will be posted by next Tuesday. So you'll have a week to do that. And then if you have not registered for the conference, don't miss it. If you want someone in your community to drink some Kool-Aid, you can invite them to the conference. I think that's all I have to say about the conference, other than it's going to be great. And just one more thing. So our keynote speaker, we just started having keynotes last year. Our keynote this year is Dr. Mamie Parker. And for those that don't know her, she's the most inspirational woman I have ever heard speak. And she's really going to be reflecting on what the last year has meant, changes in our natural world, changes in our relationships and how we relate to one another and to the natural world, and what the lessons that we've learned over the last year, how we can carry those forward into what is a very different world that now exists. So I'm really excited for that. So that's it. That's all I wanted to say about the conference.
All right, and then so for tonight's extended sessions, we have Grace and Matt have graciously agreed to stay on and answer questions. So they'll be here in the main room, and I'm also opening rooms right now. If you would like to go more into the conservation landscape assignment, then you can join Josh. And if you need kind of tech help or general support, then please join me. So as a reminder, you can click on breakouts on the bottom of your screen and you can choose one. And if you would like to, you can join one of those rooms and then come back and join Grace and Matt afterwards. So if you're going to my room, I'll be there shortly. I just want to make sure everybody's good. If you cannot figure out how to get yourself there, just type it in the chat and I will move you.
And for anyone that wants to stay with Grace and Matt, just stick around right here.
Okay, is everybody here want to be here? Perfect.
All right. All right, so this is, again, favorite time of the night where we just get to talk. So we have a pretty small group. You can, if you have questions for Grace and Matt, either go ahead and unmute yourself or raise your hand, and we'll just go around and ask questions. So here are two professionals. What questions? Go ahead, Diane.
I had a question. You mentioned most of your projects are in the critical area. I live in Crofton, which I guess isn't considered critical. I was just curious, like how far out do you go, or would you recommend some of these projects and solutions?
I mean, the great thing is we go, up into Frederick and Cumberland and other spaces too. I mean, everything is still upstream of the Chesapeake Bay and, all part of our watershed that we're trying to figure out here. The interesting thing is we get from a rainscaping standpoint, a lot of bang for our buck right next to the water. But, where we're finding the issues that really need to be solved are always going to be further upstream. And what do you do? I mean, Jim put together a great question on one of the previous ones about, should we terrace the lawn? Should we put more plants, further up? And I think that was something, we always want to think about with our clients. And so, even if we're still talking Crofton, that's a great area to start because it is a densely populated area with a lot of impervious surface that can really be worked on. And Suzanne, one of my first WSA projects was in Crofton.
Is that one the house with the hillside with the invasives?
Yeah, right on the Crofton Parkway.
I think that might even be on our conservation landscape page on our website.
Yeah,
I think it is. I love that. This hillside was totally English ivy, and they turned it into a rain garden and a whole hillside planting, and it's beautiful.
I've seen it. It is beautiful.
What's that?
Yeah. Any of these approaches can be used anywhere USA, really.
Go ahead, Elmer.
Yeah, I have a question. My possible new capstone, because my old one is no more. I'm looking at basically what is an existing but small and relatively shallow stormwater management area that's all in solid grass. And I was wondering, on a site like that, where you're starting in grass, what would be a good approach to take? Because you don't want to destabilize a slope, but you still want to, put a big footprint in right away. Any thoughts on something like that? And it's a moderately sunny site.
So it's sunny and it is on a hillside and it's grass?
Yes.
I'm thinking about your Clean Water Communities project, Grace, but the ones up in Linthicum, especially that bioswale along the grassy slope.
Yeah, it's kind of pretty close to a bioswale, but it really functions as a stormwater detention type of situation.
So Elmer, the slope that you might be referring to might be a berm, and what you might be
Yes.
describing is a dry pond. And with a berm, you're not allowed to plant on that hillside anything that is woody, because yeah. So you're asking about could you do perennials on that site?
Yeah, and I guess, how would you tackle that all at once? Or would you do it in a staged aspect over maybe 2 years? Or, what's the thought on something like that? And would you use, I know you talked about the sort of those cord fiber logs, or I'm just thinking about in the process of getting the plants to root, the stabilization of the slope.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, you could, if I got it straight, you could do a bioswale at the top of the slope to catch some of the water. But then it would you distribute it to one end or the other, or two ends. It has to be able to.
I have to look at it a little more closely, exactly how the water's coming in. I believe it's actually water coming off of a parking lot, is what it is. And I actually haven't taken close pictures of it yet. Like I said, it's a new. I've had to switch my possible site, so I'm sort of, I'm sort of at square one and I really haven't done my complete assessment yet on it. But I am thinking I'm dealing with already somewhat of a slope that is in grass, and destabilizing that is a little bit of my concern.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that you could do, and if we are working in especially in the 100-foot buffer to the critical to the bay, you have to, what you remove, you need to stabilize that day. So you could kind of.
This is in Crofton, so it would not be in that zone.
And with the way our weather's been recently, I would say, that's sort of a best practice for any project even. But, silt fence, temporary stabilization,
right.
To your question of how much do you tackle, I think it's also about, people power and what do you have, volunteer wise, or, if there's a group or a company that's going to be doing some of it for you, what we've talked about, Grace and I, before in previous presentations is, heavy versus light work. What do volunteers do versus what do you hire somebody to do? How much do you tackle at once? Because I think the tough thing to say is if you have a group of volunteers that you're leading out there for a planting project, I think it's reasonable to think one person might plant 10 to 15 gallon sized plants, but that's about the extent of it, and so to ask someone who's not doing this every day to strip out sod, amend the soil,
right,
put plants in, it's a big ask. So I think you sort of have to plan it out from a standpoint of your number of volunteers or number of people who are coming to the site also dictates, how much you start to disturb and put in that time.
Elmer, this is Jim. I'm not sure if you would necessarily have to remove the sod. Is it?
I was wondering about that. Yeah.
Is it possible that we could plant in the sod and then just, use your lasagna layering newspaper
Exactly
on top or
Yeah.
something, so you don't disturb the existing berm?
that's what I was thinking was maybe a possible option, because I'm familiar with that concept in other areas, but yeah, the lasagna method really would be a possible one there.
So one last thing for Elmer, and then we'll let some other people ask questions, but if this really is adjacent to or part of a stormwater management device, you would need permission before you did anything to that site. And it might be unlikely that if that is the berm to a stormwater management device, that they would let you plant it. So there's a layer of conversation around that. We have had people though naturalize, only mow a little bit, a couple times a year in dry ponds. So that's one alternative. And people have done meadow mixes in the basins of stormwater management devices. So how about anyone else have a question, comment?
There was one that
Go ahead,
popped up in the
Jeannie.
chat.
Jeannie, it was Jeannie's question. Go ahead, Jeannie.
Perfect.
Yes. So if we are working on a spot that is right on the water and very hilly to remove invasives and plant, how much should we allow volunteers, and then when should we involve professionals? Like what is that balance of being able to do it ourselves and we're gonna be in over our heads?
Mm-hmm. So part of that, comes in the planning phase. You would be getting a vegetative management plan or vegetative management permit for that, invasive removal and planting right near the water. And so the question becomes not only amount of disturbance and total area that you're trying to tackle, but then what do you have to actually haul away? If it's really bad invasive plant material that you've got to, cut and get out of there, is it something that you have a volunteer with a pickup truck that can, get that away? Or do you need, that first level of company professional that can, get in there and do that? And then how do you line up phase 2, which is planting and stabilization, making sure that you put it all right back and you don't, create a bigger issue. And so it's even something that we do from a professional standpoint every day, where we just phase a project within a project. And so, there's nothing bad to even say, if you're doing volunteers, hey, on, April 15th, we're going to try and tackle as much as we can. And you take kind of baby steps on that first part of the project. And that on May 15th, you're going to tackle phase 2, knowing, what you've learned off of April 15th, what you've learned from the first one. We, have a ton of projects, as Grace said, that we remove something and make sure we put it all back and stabilize it the same day. And so when the whole project might be, 200 feet of bioswale, we're only tackling, 30, 40 feet a day. And then we go on to the next part and the next part and the next part. So, always kind of taking away what you have with the amount of people. And you may find, a good example that Grace and I had at a previous presentation was a job down in Bay Ridge where, they thought they'd be able to tackle it with volunteers, and they started digging and the soil was just rocks everywhere.
It was an old road bed.
You couldn't find a way to, motivate volunteers to be able to go, well, you got to dig through 12 inches of just pure stone. I mean, had to hire a professional and add that next layer to it, but it made it easier for everybody. The next phase was then just plantings for volunteers, and it, really shined that way.
But if you were going to do this yourself, I think a good starting point would be maybe a 10 by 10 foot area. That's 100 square feet and should be pretty manageable for you and at least a handful of volunteers to get something down.
We're going a lot bigger than that.
Well, I mean, for like a first day or something.
All right, Elizabeth, I think had a question, and then Lynette.
Okay, so I came into this with a project in mind that I know I needed help with. And listening to, I've got steep slopes in a natural woodland that water's coming off the road and then going down 2 sides of a shared driveway that's 600 feet long. So the driveway itself is not the problem, it's the water coming from both sides. And I'm not sure this is going to be my capstone, but I need to do it anyway. One of my questions is if I wanted to talk to you, how does one engage with you to get ideas or that? You've said you've worked with different watershed projects.
Yeah. Suzanne and Josh, Francisca, they all have our contact information, so they can give it to you. I don't think we included in the PowerPoint, but feel free to call either Matt or I. We can talk to you.
Yeah, and what we try to do, just for a little bit of, I think what we call brain balance and all of this is, we have the professional projects that we get, cold calls on, people engage with. We have referrals through McHale that, we do that are intense, time sensitive, everybody's got an emergency kind of thing that we hop on for so many hours a week. And Grace and I mean, this is our respite. This is what we like to do, to kind of free ourselves a little bit. So the idea of we try to take on, pro bono work, extra projects, volunteer time when we can, because, well, it starts with Suzanne, but it's everybody in WSA is just pumped up about these type of projects. And that's what we like to be in. That's what we like to see. So from our end, we want to help. We want to jump on with you, even if it's just a site visit to walk through it together and start bouncing some ideas back and forth. We know at the end of the day, we're probably not going to be installing these projects, but if we can get you all in the right direction for something you're doing, that's what we want to do.
Okay, thank you. I want to share a little bit of serendipity. You can see this from the Chesapeake Conservation Landscape Council. I was cleaning up stuff from my work from 2007 when I represented NIF or CSRAS on it. Hadn't touched this thing for 15 years, and it was in a pile of paper, and then it came up tonight. I don't know what to say about that, but it's just kind of fun.
I don't know if CCLC was anywhere in your pre-reading materials, Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, but it probably should have been. And I think did Josh include that in any of the links to explore? If not, we'll send it out.
I think there was a reference.
Great organization.
I didn't notice it then, but I
Okay.
noticed it tonight on the presentation. Wow.
The 8 essential elements is something that's really fun to read. I just add one thing, and then we'll go to Lynette for Elizabeth and for anyone else that would like to have a consortium member, come out and visit your site. For those in their capstone project year, we just ask or we recommend that you meet with Josh on your site first to do your walkthrough, and that really can help sort of hone your questions and make the most of a visit with like a Grace or a Matt, and help narrow down ideas. So that was what I would suggest is the first step, is Josh. And so Lynette, go for it.
I've sort of forgotten my questions, but so I guess because we brought it up, I'm just curious, like how many sites that you go to that do involve that digging up of old soil business, and that's what we've used in our yard, because digging up sod is not for the faint of heart. So yeah, I'm just curious how often you're digging up like whole sections with large equipment versus, I doubt a lot of us will be doing that kind of thing in our projects unless I'm just underestimating what we're going to be doing. So I don't know. Lasagna method versus that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And it's a lot of times about volume. And so if we go to a site, a little further away from the water where we have more space to work with, where we have, more open areas, we can create a sort of rainscaping, project out of a larger surface area, larger space, larger rain garden, width, length, all of that. When we get to a lot of waterfront projects, space is at a premium. And the challenge is, getting that same volume dealt with within a much smaller envelope. And so usually the answer is going down, creating, what Grace was showing with some of the rain tanks, or digging out soil and creating void space with the use of gravel and sand and other media down there. But, it's really about how do we still create the same effectiveness, but usually with a much smaller envelope. Ideally, in a perfect world, bigger space, more plants, more coverage, less turf, all good things. It's just kind of the space that we're working with usually.
I have a question following up on, in your presentation, you were at a shady site, and very interesting thought you mentioned. You added in a forest conservation area with succession planting to your strategy. And I'm just curious how we might think about that longer term perspective in our plans. If we have an area with trees, I'm not quite sure how to formulate the question, but that was a really interesting idea that I took away from your talk.
Yeah, so some of it comes in larger scale planning, but it also goes into individual sites. When you're looking at say a community owned or an entity owned site,
Right.
rather than say an individual homeowner's property or something. But we've dealt with it in individual homeowners as well, because sometimes you have dedicated reforestation areas or afforestation areas within a site plan. If somebody's building a house and they have to do mitigation plantings in an area, that's essentially a forever planted area. And we kind of create that. But the nice thing is that, especially some of the grant programs that we've been working with recently, Chesapeake Bay Trust is one of them. But what you do from a rainscaping effort, what you do from a reforestation effort, is something that the county wants to get credits for. They want to be able to use that as their mitigation bank and the big picture of development happening in the county. They want to say, well, here's the good things that are happening, to help offset that. And so anytime that you can put something into kind of forever conservation, is always a good thing. It's a little bit more of a legal method, and you've got to find the right project for it. But that's always the next step we look for is instead of just a project that we're fixing something now and we're not sure what the development happens in the future, let's try to keep it that way forever.
And a good source for that, for the meadow plantings, I think it's called Northeast Wildflowers, and it's a website, and you can put in there, Northeast area shady site, and it comes up with its own mix of seeds for meadow, and they sell it. So it's really, it's a good website to use for the meadow plantings.
Okay.
Do you have any involvement in consultation on right-of-ways and like, is there interseeding or anything like that? How do they usually handle them if they're going to a more native mix?
So like off of state highway areas or something like that?
Yeah, or even utility right-of-ways, things of that sort. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, an added layer and a challenge there. But we've had some pretty good luck with the Department of Public Works, which especially handles a lot of those easement areas or right-of-way areas that, they're just like the rest of the county entities. I mean, a little different these days with COVID and not being able to go into the office and actually knock on somebody's door or, stand at their desk. But, if you can get a point of contact out there, I mean, they're looking just as well as everybody else for somebody to champion some of these sites. And so if they've got an open space that, as the county is having to pay for maintenance, just even in the form of even mowing grass on it currently, if you bring an option that is, a meadow mix, a conservation landscape, something that in the long term is going to be less maintenance and they can get some sort of credit for, in doing a best practice, that's always a great opportunity for everybody. But it is, an extra channel to go through, somebody you got to talk to through the county.
Mary, I like your backdrop of black-eyed
Oh.
Susan. It's very pretty.
Thank you, my favorite flower.
So we just have about 5 minutes left. If anybody has any questions, we can keep talking, or we can just chit chat, or we can move on if people are sort of done with extra discussion and have had enough of gotten all their questions answered from Grace and Matt. That's okay too. But I think while I have the floor, I'll just take the opportunity to say thank you so much to Grace and Matt, not only for tonight, but for all you do throughout the year to help stewards and to work on projects with us. And they're forever bailing us out of, we need someone that we can really trust to get something in. And they're forever doing that for us when we need it. And I think they have been instructing this session, although the session looks a little different than this year and than in past years, but they've been instructing this session for years and years. So we just really appreciate that long-term commitment to the organization.
You're welcome. We like you guys. That's why we like to do it. So, and we like helping people who are interested in this topic of trying to clean up the Chesapeake Bay. So
Thank you very much. It was very interesting
Thank
and
you.
informative.
you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank